Good afternoon and welcome to Progress Monitoring. That's our topic for today. And this is the KVEC SERTAC New and Emerging Teacher Cadre. So thank you for being with us. I'm Dionne Bates. So let's talk a little bit about, there's a document that KDE released around collecting, analyzing, and utilizing progress monitoring data. And so that is the document. And on the screen, if you scan that QR code, you can follow along and use that document as well. So let's start thinking about progress monitoring. I know we talk about it, we hear the words, but what does it really mean? And it's a critical and important piece of that, but it's sometimes overlooked, or sometimes we miss really important pieces of progress monitoring. And so by definition, it is a data collection. It's ongoing. And we collect data and then we analyze that data to track student progress. So we're taking a look at the data that we have on students, and we're looking to see, we write a goal around a specific skill deficit they have, and then we check that all along the way to see how our students are doing. And that really is the one thing that we can always keep an eye on, and that allows us to make different instructional adjustments or changes and the delivery, the way we deliver instruction, and how they access. So it's a really important piece of the work that we do. So the purpose of progress monitoring is to make sure that our students are achieving those IEP goals, or that they're making progress toward those, and that we're getting them access to the general education curriculum. So we're checking to see how they're doing, and then making sure that they're making adequate progress. And that we want to make sure that we're not having the same goals year after year after year, and then we're not seeing students make the progress. Sometimes that can happen, and that means maybe that we are not really getting the skill that we should be targeting, right? So this helps inform us. It helps inform our practice. And then the other thing is the legal requirements. We have federal regulations around IDEA, and we have Kentucky regulations that mandate that we do progress reviews. And we're required to at least annually to review students' progress, but we want to do that more often, because that allows us not to wait till the end of the year to say, oh, the student didn't make adequate progress, or their rate of growth was their rate of growth was significantly slower. We weren't seeing any progress at all. We don't want to wait till the end of the year to see how we're doing on that, or to the end of that IEP cycle. We want to make sure we check those things as we go along. So the reason that we do progress monitor is that we have to report, right? Part of that regulation is that we have to measure and report progress toward how students' goals. But it helps us decide if what we're teaching is working. And then it helps us change if we think that what we are doing is working, but we see that the data tells it's not, it allows us to make other changes to the instruction. We can see where the students are currently at. We also then have data for a reevaluation, right? Because if it's an initial, we're collecting data and establishing a baseline. But if we do a good job with progress monitoring, we already have that data through the reevaluation, which also drives our present level of performance. So it's all very cyclical. It all goes in a cycle that we see where the student's performing. We write a goal that helps to a reasonable goal that we want to help students to work toward, and then we check all along the way. And so part of that also is that students still have a special education disability, or a special education disability, and they need specially designed instruction. So those help us make those decisions. And so with specially designed instruction, we talk about that all the time, but when we think about the importance of how progress monitoring falls in that, is that we think about the student has an IEP, and then we decide maybe they need explicit instruction, or maybe they need the use of graphic organizers, or maybe they need direct instruction, or all of these things that we say is the SDI. And then we're giving that instruction to them in that approach, and we're checking it. And so that's what's important, that is one thing that we have 100% control over, is how we deliver instruction. So we don't always have control over how kids come to us or how we support kids, but that is certainly something that we can make an adjustment for. It also helps both the regular ed teacher and the special education teacher with decisions about instruction, lesson design, delivery, all kinds of things, because we can see maybe kids respond different ways through different styles of teaching and learning approaches. It also helps the ARC when we're trying to make decisions about what students need as a committee. We have that data. We can see, again, are they responding to this instruction or this level of support? Do we need to increase support? Do we need to take away some supports? It also encourages student engagement. We keep kids involved and we give them opportunities to demonstrate what they know and can do, and we're checking it. And then it's a great thing to have data to go into an AP meeting, but also all along the year at each along with when we give out our report cards, we're giving parents an update. How are kids doing along the way? Again, that way we don't get to the end of the year and we have this big surprise that student hasn't made hardly any progress at all. So that's what makes it so important about progress monitoring. We really want to make sure that it drives what we do every day, and it drives the teaching and learning, and it drives our specially designed instruction, what we do special for those students that have an identified disability. So one of the things that you have to do is collect that baseline data, particularly if it's a student that that's just been referred, and we're looking at where their performance is at. So establishing baseline is a process, and we're going to practice that in just a second. The other thing is, if you have a kid that transfers out of state, for example, and you don't have any progress data on them, you're going to probably have to use some strategies to collect some baseline data as well, because we have to figure out exactly what it is to work on, and we have to figure out where they're at in order to know where to move forward. And so there's lots of ways that we collect data. Observations, we have classroom assessments, we do work samples in the classroom, we look at different progress reports, but we use those tools and resources all collectively to make sure that we are kind of getting an idea where the student's at and what supports that they need. So let's do an example on that. We're going to do this one. So on the screen, let's talk a little bit about how we establish baselines, because sometimes that's a little bit confusing. And we generally say, to figure out where a student is at, we have 4 to 6 data points. I mean, that could vary just a bit, but we're looking for a pattern. We generally, at minimum, want to use 4 different kinds of probes. So this one is a math probe, right? And we're looking at Karen, and we're looking at how Karen's done on subtraction. And so I want you to take just a second and think about what we're going to do. How would we go about calculating the baseline? If we've given her these 4 separate probes, how are we going to calculate the baseline? All right, let's talk about it just a little bit more. So when we establish baseline, there are 2 ways or 2 measures that we can use for establishing baseline. One is the median, and then the other one is mean, or the average. And we generally calculate the average. That's relatively quick and easy way for us to calculate that baseline. So on the screen, you'll see that Karen, on her first assessment, scored a 40%. On the second assessment, she on the probe was 40%. The third one was 30, and the fourth one was 50. So if I'm going to calculate baseline, what am I going to do here? So we're going to add 40, 40, 30, and 50. Right? So that's the first thing that we're going to do. We're going to add those 4 scores together. And so that gives us a total of 160. And then I'm going to divide that by the number of probes that we use. So I'm going to divide that by 4. Okay, so I'm going to do 160 divided by 4, because the total scores is 160. Right. Adrian, I'm going to get 40. So that then is my baseline. So I know that there's a 40%. Karen is scoring 40% on subtracting single digit numbers, right? So that's where she's averaging at. So that's where I start. So I know that when I give her 1 digit subtraction, that she's at 40%. So if I know that, then I have to start thinking about, okay, so I want Karen to be able to improve. And so I'm going to have to decide a rate, what would be reasonable for her, how am I going to write a goal for Karen around the a math goal for her and what is going to be reasonable that she could attain within a year. So I already have started that process. So we have to establish baseline. If it's in the area of reading, I mean, maybe it's maybe it is a fluency. Maybe we look at how many words they can read correct per minute. Maybe we use a comprehension passage and we check to see their comprehension and how they score. But part of the baseline and calculating the baseline is that we have multiple data sets in order to calculate that. So we're going to use those four, add them together, and then the same way we always do average, just if we're figuring out an average for one of the classes that we've taken. If we're trying to find our class average or our individual average on a score, that's the same way we're going to do that in order to get the baseline information. So that's really important. That's one of the first pieces that we use when we're starting to think through this process of progress monitoring. So the thing about it is, and we get mixed up on this one sometimes, so let's just spend a second talking about this one. The method that we choose to calculate baseline performance should be the same method that we use to monitor progress. Okay, so if I just said on this previous slide that we were using this math probe, then if we're going to do progress monitoring, when we write that goal for that student, we're going to use math probes. So it should match, right? It's always got to match. However we use to establish baseline, we want to match that. Sometimes it gets confusing, and we might give them an oral reading fluency. We might look at their oral reading fluency, but we're trying to measure we might do a fluency check, but we're using two different kinds of measures, right? We might be using one that we're calculating correct words per minute, and then the other one we're doing oral reading fluency. So there could be a little bit of a disconnect. So we just want to make sure that we're using both. If we say we're using a probe, that we're going to continue using that probe, and we're measuring the same thing. Sometimes we write a reading goal, and it might be that we're working on basic reading skills, or we're working on letters and sounds. But then we are using probes that are measuring fluency, right? And sometimes we choose fluency because it's something that we can quickly and easily measure. So that's why we have to spend a little bit of time thinking about what are we going to use to measure that baseline, and then how are we going to continue to use that same one. So let's talk about it, right? We go back to that, and you've probably heard this lots and lots of times, thinking about the different ways that we can choose method of measurement. But when we write an IEP goal, we have to decide how we're going to measure that. And remember, we're connecting it all together. It's all about that, how that student's presently, what their present level of performance is. And remember, we have to put that baseline data in there. So we have to think, and then we're going to write a goal about where we think we want them to move to. And then we're going to check their progress. So it really is all part of this circular over and over and over. We're just checking to see how they're doing, where they're at, because we're going to adjust. We might need to reduce it, or we might need to increase the level of rigor, the cognitive demand, the level of support that they need. Again, that allows us, it informs us based on data about how we can support students. So let's think about like that curriculum-based measurement. What we just saw was a math computation probe. That was our example. That's a curriculum-based measure. When we think about oral reading fluency, right? We sometimes give kids an oral reading fluency. We just have to know if that's what we said we're going to use, and we decide that that's what we're going to use, a CBM, and we're going to use a probe, and we write that in our goal. We have to keep using that over and over and over. We can look at direct. Sometimes we have to directly or be able to see what students are doing. This one's particularly important when we're monitoring behavior, or we're trying to see how many times a behavior occurs, or we're trying to look during a time period when we're seeing something, a behavior happen, or a duration is how long a behavior is happening, or how long it takes for a student to maybe start a task. So we're thinking about which one are we going to use, and whichever one's appropriate based on the goal, then you just want to make sure you stay consistent with that. Because you see, it could be an ABC recording. We use those for behavior. We use checklists, right? We use those a lot. We use running records. And then the indirect, when I think about indirect, I always think about something you're not directly observing at that time. So you're going to go back. And I always think about a rubric, like a piece of writing. You're going to use that rubric and you'll score that, but you're not directly observing that behavior, right? It could also be that I'm using a rubric if I'm working on language mechanics, right? And I'm using a strategy and I can reflect or I can score how I use particular skills within that writing prompt. But you can see there's all kinds of things that you can choose. You might have teacher-made tests, you might have student monitoring, but those are all indirect measures. And then, of course, there's the authentic assessment. And so those are things, but they have to be paired with another one in order to be used. So just remember that whatever you choose in the goal and how you use the baseline, that should all match with the progress monitoring. It should all be connected because it's all really relevant and goes together. So we're going to practice one right now for, we're just going to work through a reading goal. So I'm going to give you just a second and I want you to read this goal. And the CWPM is the correct words per minute. Okay, so what we right now know is that the baseline is Karen read 105 words correct words per minute. Now we say here we're going to give a weekly reading fluency probe, right? So we're going to use a CBM, we're going to use a curriculum-based measure, we're going to use a probe, and we're saying that she's going to get a 5th grade passage. So she's probably in the 8th grade, I think is maybe our example. So she's going to have a 5th grade passage, or she may be in the 9th grade. When she has a 5th grade passage, and that's just important so that we know where she's at. What kind of information are we giving her? So that we want her to be able to read 195 correct words per minute. And we're going to check her each week with a probe. So she started out at 105. So in this next slide, you'll see there's lots of information here. If you'll notice the checklist that's provided in the top over on the right side of this slide, these are the pieces that are required. So take just a second and look at what is in blue on the right side of the screen. All right, so the words that are in the blue are the required pieces. So going back to the IEP guidance document and the resources that have been released with the Kentucky Department of Education to help us know what to do with progress monitoring, you'll see that the first thing is the title. So do we see a title? Yes, so we do see a baseline, and that was the 105 words correct per minute. Okay. Now this one, interestingly, with this particular graph, if you'll notice at the bottom, we're seeing some data points. You see the X's, those are data points for the first 8 weeks, right? So if you were thinking about how long do you think that this graph is set up to represent? So let's just talk through that just a little bit in case my question wasn't very clear. I'm starting at 0 here in the bottom of the corner of the bottom left-hand corner. That is 0. I see that red line is the number of, that's my baseline. And I calculated that, remember, because I probably gave her 4 to 6 probes to check her correct words per minute. And I averaged those, and that's what her average is 105. If you'll notice that this is each week, we see the first 10 weeks, the first 20 weeks. We're looking at weeks over time. So this graph is kind of looking at a year, right? If we're trying to look at what it looks like for a year. Yeah. Yeah, progress length. Yes, that's right, Justin. It's progress over length of IEP. Yes, that's right. That was good. Year of data if it's completely filled. Yes. And it's a school year. That is correct. So you can see this graph kind of represents where we want him we want Karen to be able to go. So her goal is 195. And so at the top of that screen here, you'll see here's the 195 here across the top. or 195. So that's where we want her to go. The green line is that aim line. This is what we're looking for her expected progress. So we know that she started out at 105. So then let's go ahead and look through our checklist over here to see if we have all the pieces that we need. So do we have the criterion? So our criteria is what we're expecting her to be able to do with oral reading fluency. Yep, we have the goal line at the top. Yes, we have the goal line up here at the top. Over here on the right, on the very far left-hand corner, we'll have the correct words per minute. See this one here? We have the correct words per minute. That helps us to tell what the criterion is. So you can take a look at this graph and you know what we hope that her correct words are per minute, what her oral reading fluency, what we're measuring with the table title, and then we're looking at where she started and where we want her to go. So if we would say yes, we have the aim line. Let's see what the aim line is here, criterion is here. We have baseline, we have title. Now, do we have a trend line? Do you see a trend line? Yes, we do. Thank you, Mr. May. We do see a trend line because that's what we're looking at. We're looking to see right in here, are we seeing a trend and are we expecting that to move up? So we have a trend line. The next thing is we must have data points. And so on this graph, do you see the data points? So we see the data points right here. They're all here. They're all collectively here at the bottom. And again, this is just representative of these 8-week data points, right? We see that. The other piece that's critical to mention here is that we should be looking for the month, the date, and the year. So do we see that? Without specific month, date, and year, we're not going to know when those data points occurred. If it's current now, where she's at, we don't know. So that's why it's so important is that we have to talk about what those data points are, what the month is, when it happened. But there's something that we're looking for. Because remember in her goal, we said we were going to measure how often. Can y'all remember what the goal said? This is a little quiz to remember, but what did the goal say? How often were we going to check? So weekly. So that's what we're looking for. Does that match the goal? Because that's what we're checking for. Does it match what we said we were going to do? And do we have the data that tells us that? So we do. So we would be able to check that. And we would be able to say, yep, we do have the data points. They're all there. We have a month, the date, and the year, and they match because we said those were going to be weekly. So we can real quickly glance at those numbers right there and say, is that each week? And that would say, we would be able to evaluate that and say yes. Okay, let's look at the next one. The next thing is, do we have instructional changes? Does this graph represent any instructional changes? No, we don't see any. Not that it shows. That's right. We're not looking there. So let's talk about that. Let's just stop right there and talk about that. Why would we not see an instructional change here?
Well, it looks like that she's making progress. It's kind of there's a couple of outliers. Like she is it's slow, but it is a gradual improvement. And then she hasn't scored really well. And then she kind of went backwards. And then you're thinking, oh no. Well, then she jumped back up again. So that would be maybe a reason why they're just kind of waiting to see because she is making improvement and staying close to that aim line.
We're seeing generally improving. Are those data points are we where we want to be? We do see a little bit of a regression here, and that's something to consider for discussion. But then we move back up, and like I think someone said that, or Chastity maybe even said, then we're trending back upward. So we're going to allow enough time for this instruction to make a decision if this is working or not. If we continue to see a very negative linear trend, then we're going to know that instructional change might need to occur. So that's right. So it might be that we not need to make that instructional change yet. So that gives us a lot of information. Just this one graph gives us a lot of information about um, performance. It could be we would look to see, things that were happening during that week. Were those consistently? Those look like the dates were on Fridays, right? So it looked like those were on a Friday. So every Friday we're checking. We would look to see, that might, if we're looking at progress, we're going to consider lots of different things. Was he there all week? Did he get the instruction? Did we give him explicit instruction in reading fluency strategies? Were we working with him in small groups? So there's lots of things for us to be thinking about, but we're checking. Remember, we've not waited too long. We're probably, some of you, if you do 9 weeks, 6 weeks or 9 weeks, we're going to be checking right along there, either at the 6 weeks or at the 9-week point to say, how's the student performing? So we're looking for those things. We're looking for all of those pieces. So when you see that criteria over here on the right, make sure that our graphs and our representations have all of that information in them, because it's all important. It's hard to know how the student's performing if we don't have that data, if we don't know what the trend is or where we're aiming toward. It's important to have all of those pieces. Okay, so we're going to do another one, but I'm not going to talk through this one as much. I'm going to let you all join me in that conversation. So let's take a look at what we have next. Okay, this is a math goal. And this one, I forgot, let's see. This one is Karen. So we have Karen again. And so we looked at some of the score sheets that Karen had earlier. But for our purposes, this time we have a 30% accuracy baseline. So I'm going to pause and let you all read this math goal. Okay, so in our math goal, we're looking for Karen to solve subtraction problems. So we're expecting an 80% accuracy with 4 consecutive trials. And we're going to use what? What are we going to use for our method of measurement? Yes, math probes. We're using math probes. And what is the frequency? How often are we going to check? Yes, so we're going to check each week. So right now our baseline, and you can just think back about the example we had earlier, we had the baseline come from those samples that we gave Karen multiple consecutive trials, and we calculated her score. So for purposes of this one, let's move on over and let's talk about now. I'm going to let you all spend a few minutes on this. Let's take a look and see the data and the graph that we have for Karen's performance. And I'm going to let you all just pause a moment and see what are there pieces that are missing, or do we have all of them? Okay, let's go ahead and start. Do we see the title? We have the title. Okay, are we missing the year? Okay, that's a good point. That's a good catch, Ashley. We don't have the year. So the year we don't have, okay. But we do have a title. So we're talking about her math fluency, and we're looking at subtraction. Okay, let's look at the next time. Do we have a baseline? And that baseline is, so we do have baseline. That baseline is, we're talking about her, the baseline was at 30%. Okay, do we have the criterion? Okay, we do have, we want her to have 80%. So we have that here. We probably could have put, yeah, her accuracy. So that's a percent. Okay. So Ashley says, yes, we have a criterion. So we're looking at her accuracy. We're looking at the percent that she got correct. Okay. Do we have an aim line? No. Okay. So we're missing. Well, we do have, yeah, that one's tricky. So up here, we've got, this is what we're looking for, right? What is this one? That's what we're trying to get to. We want to have 80%, right? But we are missing. So let's say we're going to say the trend line. That's right. So that's where we're getting to. Do we have the trend line? What are we noticing? Do we see a trend line? And Denny Paul says we don't see it. Do we have a trend line? Right. We don't have a trend line. Right now we're looking, we can create a trend line based on the patterns because we start here and we're trying to look at the trend, right? We're going to look at how he's progressing, but if we're expecting to get to 80%, we don't see that trend line. So if we don't see it, how are we really thinking about where we're at above or below and how those data points are falling? And so that's something we don't have. Okay, the next thing are the data points. Do we have the data points? And remember, it was that month, date, and year. Yep, so we have the month and we have the date. So we have the month and we have the date, but we don't have the year. So when you go back and look at the guidance document, it suggests that it says that we have to have the month, the date, and the year. So we can add that just by adding, if it's 2024, we would just have to make sure our graph had that, right? Anybody want to talk about why they feel like the month, the date, in the year is important in the data points? They want to venture a guess? Yes, that right. You could be looking at old data, really old data. Right, we're looking at current data for that grade level for that work. That's right. We want to make sure that yep. Oh, so Dean Paul says that we also want to make a note here. Once you hit those 4 consecutive data points that are lower than the trend line, at 11, 8 through 12, you want to make sure you make instructional changes. That's right. When we're looking at because we're needing to make another instructional change. So that would be the next piece here. What do you see on this graph? Do you see an indication that there has been an instructional change? And where do you see that? Mm-hmm. 10, 11. So we do see that representative of the graph. Mm-hmm. And that's what Mr. May was talking about. We were looking at an instructional change and how it's important to consistently monitor it and let it drive your decision making. Because if we just looked at that data point and we didn't, we made that one instructional change, we saw on 1018, 1025, a little bit of improvement, but then we see a decrease, right, by 11.1 and then 11.18. When should we have made an instructional change? What's the next time you think there should be an instructional change according to this graph? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So right, so here right in here, that's what Mr. May was just saying too, is somewhere here we want to make sure that we made another instructional change because we look right here, we got that data point, right? We drop down, we've made an instructional change, we see it 1, 2, 3, and we drop back down right here. Right, so we're going to look right here. There's probably something that happened. You're right, 11.5. Yeah, somewhere in there. And so that's what we're talking about. If we drop the ball on that and we're not continuously looking to see how students are performing in relation to where their trend is going, because we're seeing kind of a negative trend that's happening, and that rate, we're kind of falling away from where we want them to be in a year. So if we only made the one instructional change the first time we did our progress data, and we're not going back and revisiting that and looking at that each time, it could be that we've spent a greater amount of time with student using that same strategy and not yielding the results that we would expect. So it'd be really important that we always look for those opportunities for those instructional changes to occur so that we immediately address that issue rather than wait. And again, that's not what because our students are already performing, at a slower rate. And so if we can't afford to wait any longer because we have a certain urgency. Yeah. And that's so Denny Paul says that those changes should be documented in your progress report to parents. And that's why is a weekly monitoring schedule chosen? Why not a month or why not daily? And so part of that is why would you choose a weekly? Why are we going to check that? Why are we not doing it every day? Why are we not doing it monthly? And that really has a lot to do with the goal, the skills that you're working on. And if you're working on a behavior skill, you maybe are collecting data every day, right? If you're looking at time on task, if you're using some kind of duration recording or latency recording, you might be doing that every day. And so those are conversations that you have. Why is it appropriate that you check once a week? Why is it that we check every day? Or why is it that we don't go back and check on that except for once a month? But those are, thank you, Dean Paul, on that. Those are really conversations that we want to be thinking about and having because that's important, right? We're making those decisions. They're informed decisions. We're not just clicking a button, but we're really thinking through what is it that kids need to work on? How often are we going to check it? So you guys did a great job on collecting and thinking about how we collect, graph, and then interpret that data. So there was a lot of information and yeah. Okay, so Dean Paul says that we want to have enough time for instruction to impact, but not so long that students are making mistakes for a month with no instructional change. Certainly, and that's what we want to avoid. That's the whole purpose of doing those weekly checks or more frequent checks is we don't want any greater amount of time to elapse before we're having those instructional changes. We want to give them time to see if it's working, but not too long. So that's why you'll usually see weekly or twice a month at most, I think. All right, we'll move to the next slide. So that data analysis, would you, if you were answering these two questions, let's go with the first one. We're at the analysis of this data. Is the student making progress to meet their annual goal? How would you answer that? Okay. We do see that they're making some progress, right? The only thing that we might want to pause and think about, yeah, it's generally trending upwards. The only thing we would want to think about is remember our graph is missing that piece about that trend, right? And we're trying to think about how, if they're trending, how the data's trending. So let's just say we're looking up, because remember, we're trying to get all the way up to here, right? So we're on this trend up to here to get them to 80%. So when you look at it in that perspective, we generally are seeing growth, right? Because we're seeing that each time there's been overall growth throughout over the course of those 3 months or almost 4 months. So we do see generally there is a trending upward. And so that's, Adrian, what you would look at. Is there an instructional change? Is there some small things that we can adjust for Karen in terms of she's looking at subtraction that we can even increase the gains, but we are seeing the trends and we didn't see that change, that instructional change right here. We don't know what happened there exactly, but we're seeing once that other instructional change happened, then we did see some improvement. And that's part of the conversations that we have during our ARC meetings is what did we see that impacted that, and we saw that instructional change helped the student move toward their goal. And those are pieces of the analysis. So then if you answered yes, you see that they're generally trending upward, and your answer is yes, then how do you know? So if somebody asks you, how do you know in that data analysis, how could you respond? How do you know if you're saying, yes, Karen is making progress? How would you describe that? You can type that in if you want, but if a parent or Yeah, that's great, Adrian. He's saying point out the percentage gains based off the dates. So you could talk about the dates, the percentages, right? You could talk about where we're seeing the growth. Yes, that is absolutely one way that you could answer that. How do you know? You have that data, you have those percentages. Yes. Any other thoughts about that? How else would you answer that question? How do you know? And what I'm thinking about here is the visual. If you have a visual that a parent can see, I may not know all the language about standards, progression, cognitive demand. I may not know all the language, but that's right. Yeah, you could use the graph. Yes, right, because parents may not understand or be able to know those pieces of the skills and how we break down standards and how we design our goals and our instruction, but they can see that visual representation. Right. That's right. It is a jargon that we use and we use it all the time. But for a parent to be able to see and have a visual, I mean, generally you can make that observation that it's trending upward. Or if we can see trending down, there's never surprises by the annual review. If parents are getting good progress data along the way, they know how their students are doing. And they can be partners in the work that we do. Regular ed teachers can, as we talk about these during meetings, we can talk about we're seeing progress for students. And it's just important that we all are looking and continuing to analyze that. You know, we live in a world of data and we have lots and lots of data, right? We're data rich, but information poor. You may have heard that quote, but we do have a lot of data. And how do we use that? And how do we help support our students with the use of that data? So I think that was great. Any other thoughts on that? Okay, we'll move on to the next slide. Let's see, Danny Paul's got some formative assessments should occur every day with every lesson in our academic goals. Right. We can use those to guide instructional decisions, to take data to report on progress less frequently. But progress monitoring, if possible, should occur within the natural flow of instruction over an event. Right. And that's a good point. We just have to think about, you know, we do formative assessment every day. Every time, if you're teaching that lesson or you're pulling that student back to your teacher station, or you're doing small group instruction, because we're teaching and providing instruction and SDI while on the days that we're not always just checking progress, right? We always are continuously assessing students' knowledge or gains through formative assessments, through checks on their performance or their work every day. So we're always assessing. So we have an idea, right? That's how we can make corrections quickly before even the next data point. If they're making, if they're having an error, if it's a computation error and they're making an error, we can correct that pretty quick. So we have to think about that. And we're always assessing students, but to collect those data points, we're always full of information and data that we can use. So just be thinking, you know, as you do that every day and how well they're doing along the way, but then it is part of that instruction. You can also kind of integrate that progress monitoring right into what you do all the time. You can have that in your small group instruction, or as you're working through stations, or if you're parallel teaching, or if you're working in an alternative co-teaching model, or if you're working and pulling the kids to the resource room, you can blend those in. And I think that's what Dean Paul was talking about, is those occur naturally as we give instruction. So we want to make sure that we're consistent in the data collection. And then we're thinking about different sources of data. And we're making sure that we're accurate, because if we're collecting data along the way, but there's a big discrepancy with some of the other data that we're collecting, or what we see happen in the classroom, or their regular performance, then we want to make sure that we're collecting the right information. And we always want to go back and review that. And we think about that commensurate with the issuance of report cards, or when we give them report cards. We just want to make sure that we're checking their data, that we don't let too far along elapse. It's the same thing that we do within MTSS, right? We don't want to wait until we're not a model of wait till kids fail, but we want to give those interventions before they have that negative impact. And how important it is to be able to collaborate with that progress monitoring, how the students are doing all along the way. and in terms of how they're doing with the standards and their access to grade level standards. So again, it's important for regular ed teachers and administrators, who those ARC chairpersons, talking about that with kids and their families about how well they're doing along the way. Are we making gains, or are we celebrating those successes? So here's a whole bunch of links to resources that you can have, but those are all data, all links that are, you can find them in that collecting, analyzing, and using progress data resource that I shared with you at the beginning. And you'll see there's all kinds of goal monitoring and progress monitoring links, but there's also the IEP guidance document that has that whole section. I think it starts on page 82 or 83 about progress monitoring, and help us to be able to do a good job with progress monitoring. Thank you for joining us and being here with us.